Chapter 2. The Problem of Evil.
There's no one reason. I just see no reason to think he does exist. You look disappointed.
Kind of, yeah. How would you respond if I said about my belief in God? There's no one reason, I see no reason to think atheism is true.
Fair enough. Well, how about the problem of evil? Right now, as we sit here drinking coffee in these cushy chairs, people are starving to death, and children are being sexually trafficked. Think about that for a moment. Right now, that doesn't bother you?
Of course it bothers me.
How could a loving God allow that?
Well, I do think the problem of evil is the greatest emotional obstacle to belief in God. But while I think it's a strong emotional obstacle, I don't think it's a strong intellectual one. Let me show you what I mean. Some Christians might say to you something like,
"How can you say that your deceased loved ones are no more? How horrible to believe that you'll never see them again."
That's a strong emotional obstacle to atheism, perhaps. But you at least don't think it's a good intellectual argument, right?
Right? It's wish fulfillment, pure and simple. But the problem of evil isn't like that. I think it is a good argument against God. Look, the atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie, I'm sure you've heard of him, maintained that belief in God is irrational, for if God were all-knowing, he would know that there is evil in the world. And if he were all-powerful, he could prevent it. And if he were all-good, then he would wish to prevent it. The fact that there is still evil in the world proves that your God doesn't exist. Or if he does, that he must be impotent, ignorant, or wicked. What do you think about that?
Yes, I'm aware of Mackie's argument. I don't think it works.
Why?
Mackie was wrong. The existence of God and the existence of evil aren't mutually exclusive. How about we take a look at the three attributes he mentions? Omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence.
Yeah. Start with his omnipotence. Why isn't your God strong enough to prevent evil?
Omnipotence doesn't mean the ability to do what is logically impossible.
Why not?
Why not? What do you mean, why not?
If God is all-powerful, why can't he do the logically impossible?
Because what is logically impossible is contradictory, and what is contradictory cannot exist in reality. In a contradiction, one part negates the other. God can't create a square circle, because to be circular is not to be square and vice versa. No object in reality can be both square and circular. God also can't lie. To do so would contradict his nature.
Can God create a rock too heavy for him to lift?
Right, that's another example. This objection is essentially asking, can an all-powerful being create something that proves he's not all-powerful? But again, that's a contradiction. It's like saying God is both all-powerful and not all-powerful, but that's not possible. That phrase can't correspond to anything in reality. It borders on nonsense. The words have meaning, but one part of the phrase negates the other. It's the kind of thing we can say out loud, but when we think about it, we realize it's impossible. Or at least we should.
Okay, fair enough. But we're not talking about rocks or square circles. We're talking about evil. Why can't an all-powerful being prevent that?
Right, I was getting to that. It's possible for God to create beings with the kind of free will that can choose between good and evil. Yeah? But he can't also force those creatures to freely choose good. If he forced their choice, it wouldn't be free. There's a great quote from C.S. Lewis who said,
"If you choose to say God can give a creature free will and at the same time withhold free will from it, you have not succeeded in saying anything about God."
In other words, God isn't going to withhold free will after having given it. If, all things being equal, it's better that some creatures have free will than not, then we have to accept the possibility that evil may occur. Free creatures may commit moral evils. It reminds me of something St. Augustine said.
A runaway horse is better than a stone that stays in the right place, only because it has no movement or perception of its own. And in the same way, a creature that sins by free will is more excellent than one that does not sin, only because it has no free will.
Okay, well, let's say, for the sake of argument, that belief in God's existence isn't necessarily irrational. Isn't his existence still highly improbable in light of the meaningless suffering creatures have to endure?
How do you know it's meaningless? I don't think it's meaningless in light of God's second attribute, his omniscience. If God has infinite knowledge, then he knows many things we don't. Right? This means that he may, in fact, have good reasons for permitting things like evil and suffering, though they seem inexplicable to us. We human beings have a very limited vantage point, so we often lack knowledge about things of great significance. What appears to us to be a tragedy may actually be something that brings about great good, and conversely, what appears to us as a good thing may, in the long run, prove harmful.
If God has good reasons to let us suffer, then why doesn't he at least let those who are suffering feel his presence? If I have a kid one day and he's suffering, you better believe I'll be by his side the entire time, telling him that I love him and am there for him.
Well, as a Christian, that's precisely what I believe God has done and is doing. Not only does he console us through his revelation, the sacraments, and the help of others, he also entered into our suffering. He endured the most ignominious, torturous death imaginable to show his love for us. And so we can never say, "You don't know what I'm going through."
Well, I think the idea of a God who decides to have himself killed to show us he loves us is ridiculous, I have to say.
Just because it appears ridiculous from your vantage point doesn't mean it is ridiculous. Anyway, I'd like to get back to your analogy of the suffering child. I think that analogy actually makes my point. Think about a small child being taken to the doctor for his immunization shots. He knows the needle hurts and he can't understand why his own parents are allowing the doctor to cause him pain. He doesn't understand that the inoculations help prevent the much greater suffering of disease. He's unable to perceive the greater good. In a similar way, we should recognize that a being with more knowledge than us, like God, may have good reasons for things, even pain and suffering, that we are unaware of, and so he allows evil to exist because of his omniscience, not in spite of it.
I can tell you've thought about this a lot, and I respect that, but I'm not buying it. I mean, what about God's third attribute, his omnibenevolence? God is supposed to be all good and perfectly loving. What loving father allows his children to endure awful amounts of suffering if he could prevent it?
Well, I think I've begun to address that by talking about what God's omnipotence does not mean, preventing people from using their free will to harm each other, and how God's omniscience means he may have good reasons for allowing us to suffer. Perhaps a big part of our problem is that we have this false, hallmark view of God. We think of God as the, well, wait. Let me read something C.S. Lewis talked about in The Problem of Pain. So I'm just looking it up. Here it is.
By the goodness of God we mean nowadays almost exclusively his lovingness, and in this we may be right, and by love in this context most of us mean kindness. What would really satisfy us would be a God who said of anything we happen to like doing,
"What does it matter so long as they are contented?"
We want, in fact, not so much a Father in heaven as a grandfather in heaven, a senile benevolence who, as they say, like to see young people enjoying themselves, and whose plan for the universe was simply that it might be truly said at the end of each day, "A good time was had by all."
I think many people have this sort of view of God. And look, if that's the sort of God Christians were saying exists, then I'd agree. He either doesn't exist or is doing a terrible job. But this isn't at all the God of Christianity. We don't believe that God created us merely for happiness in this life, but also, and most importantly, for eternal happiness with him in the next.
Are you telling me that if something tragic happened to you, it wouldn't shake your faith?
No, I'm not saying that.
Well, what would it take?
To lose my faith.
Yeah.
I think a more interesting and fruitful question for our purposes is what should it take, not what would it take. I have no idea what would make me lose my faith. Maybe if I found out I had cancer or that my dad had died in a motorbike accident, that would do it. But this gets back to what I was saying earlier. The problem of evil can cause a strong emotional obstacle to belief in God. The evil of cancer or losing my dad might make me lose faith, but I don't think it should. Anyway, I don't think the problem of evil is a strong intellectual argument against the existence of God. In fact, rather than disproving God's existence, I think the reality of evil actually points to God's existence. If evil exists, then it follows that morality exists. If morality exists, then it follows that God exists.
I don't see how that follows at all.
Okay, let me ask you this. What do you think evil is? How do you define it?
I feel like we should have probably cleared that up earlier. Stuff that's not right. Things we would never want to happen. How do you define it?
I think I'd say evil is the way things should not be. When we think of school shootings, sexual trafficking, the stuff you mentioned earlier, we have this inherent reaction that it's not right, that these things shouldn't be happening.
Okay, yeah.
But if there's a way things should not be, doesn't that imply that there's a way things should be? My point is simply that if atheism is true, there isn't a way things should be. There might be social norms, behaviour that we as a society deem either acceptable or unacceptable, but there wouldn't be a way things should be. Since evil implies there is a way things should be, it sort of serves as an indirect proof against atheism, don't you think?
Why isn't there a way things should be if atheism is true?
Because if atheism is true, things just are. And as David Hume says, you can't derive an ought from an is. You can't argue how things should be from how they exist now.
You're referring to Hume's law, yes?
Yes. Don't you see how if Hume's law is true, there can be no real evil because there is no way things should be? If Hume's law is true, then evil is just an illusory psychological projection of ours on the world.
Wait a minute. If Hume's law is true, then it is impossible to derive an ought from an is. But didn't you say earlier that God can't do the impossible?
I did.
So if Hume's law is true, then evil does not exist, as you said a moment ago. But if evil does not exist, then you can't argue, as you did earlier, that the reality of evil points to God's existence.
Not bad, Mark. But I have a response.
I'm all ears.
Well, it's not really mine. I got it from reading Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue. Let me see, I might have it in my bag. Nope. Well, anyway, it basically boils down to this. God, as an intelligent and free cause, can endow things with natural functions and purposes. When something has a natural function, there are ways it should act and ways it should not act. And this lays the basis for morality. Only in such a moral framework can the sufferings of this life have any meaning. It may be a mystery why an all-good God allows suffering and evil to take place, but at least on this view, there is meaning and purpose, and God can ultimately bring about justice and draw good out of the sufferings of this life.
So it sounds like you're saying that Hume's law is true if atheism is true, and false if theism is true, which means I've argued you into a stalemate.
That's not how I see it. Earlier I said that the reality of evil actually points to God's existence, because I thought you accepted the reality of evil.
Maybe I should have been clearer. It's not that I think evil literally exists, but that the goodness we should find if God exists is absent. And much of what we see seems so horrible. Let me read to you how Dawkins puts it. It's on my phone. One sec. Okay, here it is.
The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect, if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Okay, that does help me understand better where you're coming from.
Good.
Like I said earlier, the problem of evil is the greatest emotional obstacle to belief in God. It's also very complicated. We could probably talk about it for days. Let's continue our discussion in the next chapter.